Snow swirls in a blinding fury, a relentless white wall that swallows sound and sight. A lone knight, clad in heavy, ice-crusted mail, stumbles through the deepening drifts. His breath forms fleeting clouds that are instantly torn away by the gale. The reassuring warmth of his steed is a memory. The flickering torchlights of his distant castle are nothing but a ghost of hope in his mind. He is utterly alone, a solitary figure pitted against the raw, unforgiving power of a medieval winter. In this moment, stripped of all modern comforts, his survival hinges not on strength of arms, but on something far more profound, a deep, ancestral knowledge of how to endure the cold. This wasn't just a battle against an enemy army, but a daily struggle against the elements, a test of human ingenuity that most of us can scarcely comprehend today. How did anyone survive such brutal conditions without the technology we take for granted? How did our ancestors not only endure but build civilizations in the face of such icy adversity? This question lies at the heart of a fascinating historical mystery, one that reveals a world of forgotten wisdom and incredible resilience. We often think of the medieval period in terms of castles, knights, and grand battles, but beneath that romantic veneer lies a harsher, more tangible reality. For the common person, for the traveler, for the soldier caught far from home, winter was a season of genuine peril. A single storm could mean the difference between life and death. There were no weather forecasts, no heated shelters just a short drive away, no synthetic fabrics to wick away moisture. Survival depended on an intimate understanding of the environment, on techniques passed down through generations, techniques that were often ingenious, sometimes bizarre, and frequently shrouded in the mists of time. These were not just random acts of desperation. They were calculated strategies born from centuries of observation and experience, a secret language of survival whispered from parent to child. Today, we're embarking on a journey to uncover those secrets. We're going to step into the frozen footsteps of those who came before us, to decode the lost arts of medieval snow survival. This is more than just a history lesson. It's an exploration of human tenacity. We'll uncover how they found shelter in a featureless white landscape, how they created fire from a world of ice, and how they sourced water and food when everything was locked in a deep freeze. Some of these methods will astound you with their simplicity and brilliance, while others will remind us of the sheer determination of the human spirit. So, join me as we pull back the curtain on a forgotten chapter of history and discover the remarkable story of how humanity learned to conquer the cold. To truly grasp the ingenuity of medieval survival, we first need to understand the sheer scale of the adversary they faced. We are not talking about a picturesque blanket of snow that melts away after a few days. The medieval period, particularly from around the 14th to the 19th centuries, coincided with a climatic phenomenon known as the Little Ice Age. Winters were not merely seasons, they were prolonged, brutal sieges of cold. Temperatures routinely plummeted to depths that would bring our modern cities to a standstill. Rivers like the Thames in London froze solid enough to host sprawling frost fairs, and the Baltic Sea would ice over, creating temporary bridges of ice where there should have been open water. This was a world gripped by cold for months on end, a reality far removed from our own experience of winter. For the vast majority of the population living in rural villages, the first heavy snowfall was a moment of profound consequence. It acted as a final, unyielding gate, slamming shut and severing the fragile threads that connected communities. Roads, little more than muddy tracks in the best of times, vanished beneath deep, impassable drifts. A journey of a few miles to a neighboring village for trade or aid became an impossible, lethal gamble. Castles, seemingly impregnable fortresses, transformed into icy prisons. Their high stone walls, designed to keep invaders out, now served to trap their inhabitants within, surrounded by a silent, white moat of snow. The world shrank to the immediate vicinity of one's own hearth. News from the outside world ceased. The comforting sounds of travelers and traders were replaced by an unnerving, profound silence, broken only by the moan of the wind and the occasional crack of a tree limb succumbing to the weight of ice. This isolation made every aspect of daily life a precarious balancing act. Agriculture, the very foundation of medieval society, ground to a halt. The frozen earth was as hard as iron, incapable of being tilled. Livestock, the primary source of wealth and food for peasants, faced starvation unless fodder had been meticulously stockpiled during the harvest. A single extended cold snap could wipe out an entire community's herd, condemning them to famine come spring. Within the stone walls of a peasant's home, the cold was a persistent, invasive presence. Simple tasks like drawing water from the well became a dangerous chore, risking frostbite and falls on icy paths. The threat of hypothermia was constant, especially for the very young and the elderly. A poorly maintained fire, a leak in the roof letting in snow, or a dwindling supply of firewood could escalate from an inconvenience to a life or death crisis within a matter of days. In such an environment, knowing how to read the snow for signs of an approaching storm, understanding how to construct a windbreak from gathered branches, or mastering the art of starting a fire with damp tinder were not hobbies or interesting bits of trivia. These skills were the bedrock of existence. They were the difference between seeing the first green shoots of spring and becoming just another anonymous casualty of a season that showed no mercy. Facing such an unrelenting environment, the first and most crucial line of defense was not a castle wall or a sword, but the very clothes on one's back. In a world without central heating or quick-dry synthetics, the choice of fabric was a matter of life and death, and one material reigned supreme: wool. To understand why, we have to look at the remarkable properties of the sheep's fleece itself. Wool fibers are naturally coated in a waxy substance called lanolin, which is essentially sheep's own waterproofing oil. This makes wool uniquely hydrophobic, meaning it resists absorbing moisture. Unlike cotton, which soaks up water like a sponge, becoming heavy, cold, and dangerously conductive of body heat, wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture before it even begins to feel damp to the touch. More importantly, even when saturated, the core of the wool fiber traps tiny pockets of air, preserving its insulating qualities. A soaked woolen cloak would still provide critical warmth where a linen or cotton garment would lead rapidly to hypothermia. This biological marvel was harnessed through a meticulous system of layering, a principle as vital then as it is to modern outdoor enthusiasts. The foundation of this system was not wool, but linen. Against the skin, a medieval person would wear a long undershirt, called a smock for women and brayas for men, made from finely woven linen. This might seem counterintuitive, but linen's ability to wick moisture away from the body was essential for managing perspiration. By drawing dampness away from the skin and into the outer wool layers where it could evaporate, the linen layer helped keep the body dry, preventing a dangerous chill from setting in during periods of exertion. Over this base layer came the workhorse of the medieval wardrobe, the woolen tunic. This was a thick, sturdy garment, often knee-length, woven from coarse wool felted for additional wind resistance. Its loose fit was deliberate, creating a layer of insulating air between the linen undershirt and the tunic itself. The legs were protected by woolen hose, which were not socks but individual, tightly fitted leggings that reached from the foot to the upper thigh, fastened by points or laces, to the waistband of the brayas. A wealthy noble might have hose tailored from fine, dense wool, while a peasant's would be rougher but equally functional. For the torso, additional layers could be added as needed: a second, heavier tunic, or a woolen surcoat. The entire ensemble was crowned by the most iconic piece of medieval outerwear, the heavy cloak or the hooded mantle, known as a chaperon. This was not a simple cape. It was a large, thick, often voluminous garment designed to be wrapped around the body, providing a versatile barrier against wind and snow. The attached hood could be drawn tight around the face, leaving only a small opening for the eyes. The genius of this layered approach was its adaptability. During hard labor, outer layers could be removed to prevent overheating and sweating, then donned again during rest. Repairs were straightforward. A torn tunic could be patched, and a worn-out cloak could be relined, making the clothing system sustainable and practical for a lifetime of harsh winters. Every thread, every stitch, was a testament to a hard-won understanding of how to create a portable fortress of warmth. But a knight wrapped in a woolen fortress would still be defeated if his feet were left vulnerable to the frozen ground. While the layered torso was a masterpiece of insulation, footwear presented a unique and dangerous challenge. The standard shoe for centuries, from peasant to noble, was the turnshoe. This was a clever design where the leather upper was stitched inside out to a flexible sole, and then the entire shoe was turned right side out, hiding the seams and making it relatively waterproof. This worked well enough on dry, cold paths, but it was disastrous in deep, wet snow. The leather would eventually soak through, and once wet, it would freeze solid around the foot, creating a miniature ice prison that led directly to frostbite and trench foot, a debilitating condition we now associate with World War I, but was a grim reality for medieval travelers and soldiers. Ingenuity, however, rose to meet this perilous problem, not by reinventing the shoe, but by building a platform beneath it. The solution was the patten, a simple yet brilliant piece of technology that functioned like medieval snowshoes for urban and path-based travel. Pattens were wooden overshoes, consisting of a flat wooden sole often made of alder or willow for its water resistance, and a leather strap that fastened over the wearer's normal shoe. The key feature was that the wooden sole was raised from the ground by two small wooden rings or a carved heel, elevating the foot an inch or more above the mud, slush, and freezing water that pooled on pathways. You can think of them as the functional ancestor to modern waterproof galoshes or even platform shoes, designed purely for practical elevation. For a woman fetching water from a frozen well or a merchant traversing the slush-filled streets of a town, pattens were indispensable, keeping the primary footwear dry and intact. Inside the shoe itself, the battle for warmth was fought with whatever materials were at hand. Felted wool liners were common. Wool fabric was pounded and matted into a dense, sock-like insert that provided a critical barrier against the cold leather. But perhaps the most widespread and clever insulator was something far more humble: straw. Dry straw or hay was readily available in even the poorest households, and it possessed excellent insulating properties. Peasants would tightly pack their shoes with fresh, dry straw, which created a layer of trapped air that slowed heat loss from the foot. This stuffing also had the added benefit of wicking away a small amount of moisture, and when it became damp or matted, it could be easily replaced with a fresh handful, a small but vital act of maintenance that could prevent a fatal chill. For those on long journeys, stuffing boots with straw was as routine as feeding a horse. Beyond these common adaptations, evidence points to more specialized winter boots in particularly harsh climates. While the fully fur-lined boot we imagine might have been rare, it's likely that northern cultures, from the Scottish Highlands to the Scandinavian fjords, developed footwear with fur linings or used untanned hides with the hair still on, worn with the fur facing inward for direct warmth. A guardsman standing watch on a castle rampart for hours in the dead of night would have relied on such gear. His survival and the security of the fortress depended on maintaining circulation in his extremities. Frostbitten feet meant a soldier who could not fight, could not flee, and could easily succumb to infection. Therefore, the evolution of footwear was not merely about comfort. It was a direct response to the brutal calculus of winter survival, where protecting one's feet was synonymous with preserving one's life. Even with the best woolen layers and insulated footwear, exposure to the relentless wind and wet of a blizzard would sap a person's life force in a matter of hours. The single most critical decision anyone caught in a storm could make was to find or create shelter immediately. Movement through a whiteout was not only disorienting but deadly, as every step expended precious energy and increased the risk of injury. The priority shifted from traveling to surviving the night. In such a desperate situation, the very substance that was the source of the danger, the snow itself, could become a lifesaver. Snow, especially when packed, has remarkable insulating properties. It is filled with trapped air, which acts as a barrier against the much colder outside temperatures. A well-constructed snow shelter could maintain an internal temperature just below freezing. a stark contrast to the sub-zero winds howling outside, and that difference was everything. The most immediate form of refuge was the snow trench. This was a solution of pure desperation, requiring no tools other than one's own hands and a willingness to burrow. A traveler would simply find a deep snowdrift and dig a narrow trench just wide enough to crawl into, deep enough to get their entire body below the surface. The goal was to get out of the wind, the true killer. Once inside, they might pull their cloak over the opening or cover it with a shield or branches if available. While this offered minimal comfort, it transformed a lethal situation into a survivable one. A more advanced and significantly warmer option was a quin-hee, a shelter used by indigenous peoples of North America, and a technique that would have been discovered independently by medieval Europeans in snowy regions. To build a quin-hee, you first pile your gear, a backpack, a saddlebag into a mound, and then cover it completely with a thick layer of snow, packing it down firmly. Then you carefully dig out the gear from one side, leaving a hollow, domed cavity. The pile of equipment creates a space without having to dig into a solid snowbank, which requires more effort. The key step is to poke a small ventilation hole in the roof with a stick to prevent carbon dioxide buildup from your own breath. Inside this snow cave, the temperature would stabilize, and a single candle could raise it by several degrees, creating a fragile but effective pocket of safety. For those with a bit more time and resources, such as hunters, charcoal burners, or foresters who spent extended periods in the woods, semi-permanent shelters were essential. These individuals were the true experts in winter wilderness survival. A common and effective structure was the lean-to. They would seek out a natural windbreak, like a rock face or a fallen tree, and lean large branches against it to form a slanted roof. This roof was then thatched with layers of smaller branches, pine boughs, and ferns, creating a thick, shingled effect that shed snow. The final, brilliant touch was to then pack snow against the outside of the structure. This might seem counterintuitive, but that layer of snow sealed the gaps between the branches, eliminating drafts and adding a powerful insulating shell. Inside, the floor would be covered with a deep bed of fresh pine boughs or dry leaves, which provided insulation from the frozen ground. A small fire could be built just outside the open front, with the rock face reflecting the heat back into the shelter. This created a surprisingly warm and dry refuge, a testament to using the forest's own materials to create comfort in the cold. The most substantial winter dwellings were built by those whose livelihoods kept them in the deep woods for seasons at a time, like charcoal burners. These were not temporary huts but sturdy, semi-permanent huts often built into the side of a hill or bank. They would excavate a small recess and then build up low walls with logs or stones, creating a single room that was partly underground, benefiting from the earth's consistent temperature. The roof was a frame of sturdy poles covered in a thick layer of turf, sods of grass and soil cut from the ground. Turf is an exceptional insulator, and a roof covered in it, especially when blanketed by winter snow, created a seal that kept warmth in and cold out. The chimney, if there was one, was a simple hole in the roof, and the entrance would often be a low, narrow tunnel that acted as a cold trap, preventing icy air from flowing directly into the living space. These huts were dark, smoky, and cramped by modern standards, but for a medieval woodsman, they were a warm, dry fortress in the heart of the frozen wilderness. The very snow that isolated them from the world was harnessed as a building material, packed around the walls and on the roof to become part of the structure's defense against the elements. This profound understanding that you could fight the cold by using the cold's own tools was a cornerstone of medieval survival wisdom. Yet the strategies for warmth varied dramatically depending on one's place in the rigid feudal structure. The experience of winter was split into two starkly different worlds: the smoky, single-room cottage of the peasant and the sprawling, stone-built castle of the nobility. For the vast majority of the population, home was a simple, one-room structure that housed both the family and their precious livestock. The centerpiece of this humble dwelling was the central hearth, an open fire pit on the packed earth floor. While the crackling flames provided essential heat and a means to cook, This design came with a significant and constant hazard: smoke. Without a proper chimney, the thick, acrid smoke from the fire had nowhere to go but up, slowly filtering through a simple hole in the thatched roof. The entire room would be perpetually filled with a hazy layer of smoke, which, while helping to cure and preserve meats hung from the rafters, also led to chronic respiratory problems for the inhabitants. Everyone lived, ate, slept, and breathed in this smoky atmosphere, their eyes stinging and lungs taxed by the very source of their survival. The walls of these cottages were typically constructed using wattle and daub, a technique where a woven lattice of wooden strips, the wattle, was daubed with a sticky mixture of clay, soil, animal dung, and straw. When properly maintained, this created a reasonably solid and insulating barrier. But the reality of a medieval winter meant that these walls were often damp. Driving rain and melting snow could seep into the earthen mixture, and the constant cycle of freezing and thawing would cause the daub to crack, letting in cruel drafts. The floor was simply beaten earth, which could become damp and muddy, sucking heat from bare feet. The entire family would sleep together on a pile of straw mattresses, huddling for shared body heat, their breath visible in the frigid air just inches from the warmth of the hearth. Warmth was a localized phenomenon in such a space. One side of your body could be roasting while the other was chilled by a draft from the door. Survival here was a raw, intimate battle against the elements, fought daily within the confines of a single smoky room. Contrast this with the formidable stone castles of the nobility, which presented a completely different set of challenges. A castle's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness in winter: its stone construction. Those massive walls, impervious to arrows and siege engines, were excellent conductors of cold. They would absorb the chill from the outside air, radiating a damp, penetrating cold inward that could make interior spaces feel like iceboxes. To combat this, castle architects and inhabitants developed sophisticated solutions. The heart of the castle during winter was the Great Hall. This vast, cavernous space was designed for communal living. Its most prominent feature was the enormous central fireplace, a massive stone structure large enough to roast an entire ox. The heat from such a fire was immense, but it was also inefficient. Most of the warmth rose high into the timbered roof, leaving those on the stone floor still feeling the cold. The ingenious response to this was the use of textiles as insulation. Stone walls throughout the castle's living quarters were hung with heavy, woven tapestries. These were not merely decorative artworks depicting hunting scenes or biblical stories. They were a primary line of defense against the cold. The thick wool and woven fabrics acted as a barrier, trapping a layer of still air against the stone and dramatically reducing drafts. A room lined with tapestries felt significantly warmer and less damp than one with bare walls. For the lord and his family, the ultimate refinement in winter comfort was the solar. This was a smaller, private room located off the main hall, often on an upper floor. Its smaller size made it far easier to heat than the vast hall. The solar would have its own, more efficient fireplace, sometimes with a carved stone hood to better direct smoke up the flue and heat into the room. Here, the lord and lady could retreat from the communal chaos of the hall, enjoying a degree of privacy and relative warmth that was unimaginable to the peasant in their field. Carpets or thick rushes covered the cold stone floors, and fur-lined cloaks and blankets provided additional personal insulation. The castle, therefore, did not defeat winter through sheer brute force, but through a combination of architectural adaptation and the strategic deployment of wealth. It was a managed cold, a calculated comfort that, while still austere by our standards, represented a world of luxury compared to the desperate, smoke-filled struggle for warmth just beyond its walls. Whether in the smoky confines of a peasant's cottage or the tapestry-hung chambers of a castle, the single most vital point in any dwelling was the source of flame. A fire was not merely for comfort, it was the pulsating heart of the home, a living entity that provided heat for survival, light for work during the long dark hours, and the means to cook food and purify water. Allowing this heart to stop beating, especially during the depths of winter, was a catastrophic failure. This meant that the struggle for warmth was a year-round endeavor, beginning not with the first snowflake, but in the warmth of the summer sun. The acquisition and preparation of fuel was a relentless, communal task that defined the rhythm of life. For the peasant, the primary fuel was wood, gathered from common lands or the edges of the Lord's forest. This was backbreaking work. Trees were felled with axes, cut into manageable logs, and then split. But green, freshly cut wood is full of sap and moisture. It burns poorly, producing more smoke than heat. The real secret to a good fire was patience. That freshly split wood had to be stacked carefully in a woodpile, sheltered from rain but exposed to the sun and wind, for months on end. Only after a long summer of seasoning would the logs become light, dry, and ready to burn cleanly and efficiently, releasing the stored energy of the sun that the tree had absorbed years before. In regions where trees were scarce, particularly across the boggy landscapes of Ireland, Scotland, and parts of England, people turned to the earth itself for fuel. They became experts in harvesting peat, a dense, spongy material formed from centuries of decaying vegetation in waterlogged bogs. Cutting peat or turf was a skilled, messy job done in the late spring and early summer. Using a special tool called a slane, a type of long-handled spade, they would cut rectangular bricks of wet peat from the bog. These bricks were then laid out across the moorland to dry in the wind and sun for weeks, needing to be turned regularly. A successfully dried peat brick was a compact, earthy fuel that burned with a slow, steady, and intensely hot flame, producing a distinctive, fragrant smoke. A well-stocked peat stack by the cottage door was a sign of a family prepared for winter, a testament to their foresight and labor. For those who needed intense, consistent heat for crafts like blacksmithing, or for the wealthy who desired a cleaner burning fuel, there was charcoal. The production of charcoal was an industrial process undertaken by specialized woodsmen and the colliers, who lived for weeks at a time in the forest. They would build large, carefully controlled mounds of wood, cover them with turf or clay, and then set them smoldering for days. This slow burning in a low-oxygen environment drove off water and volatile compounds, leaving behind nearly pure carbon. Charcoal burned hotter and cleaner than wood, but its production was complex and expensive, making it a luxury fuel for many. Once winter arrived, the focus shifted from gathering to preservation. The fire in the hearth was never allowed to go out completely from the first frost until the spring thaw. Letting it die meant facing the arduous and uncertain task of restarting it from scratch, a dangerous proposition in freezing conditions. Each evening, as the family prepared for sleep, a critical ritual was performed. The burning logs would be carefully pushed together into a tight pile at the back of the hearth. Then, a large, slow-burning log, often green or unseasoned wood, was placed on top. This was the night log, and its purpose was not to blaze brightly, but to smolder through the night, preserving a core of glowing embers buried within the ash. The entire pile would then be covered with a thick layer of ash, a technique called banking the fire. This ash acted as an insulator, dramatically slowing the burning process and preventing the embers from consuming themselves before morning. Waking up to a few hot coals was a moment of profound relief. With a handful of dry tinder and a few gentle breaths, a new flame could be coaxed to life, saving the precious contents of the tinderbox. This tinderbox was, without exaggeration, one of the most valuable objects a medieval person owned. It was a small, often worn container that held the fundamental tools for creating fire: a piece of flint, a striker made of high-carbon steel, and a supply of charcloth. Charcloth is a fascinating material in its own right. It was made by taking small squares of linen cloth and heating them in a tiny, airtight tin until they were charred but not turned to ash. This process left the cloth blackened and brittle, but with a crucial property: it would catch and hold a spark at a very low temperature. To create fire, the user would place a piece of this charcloth on top of the flint. Then, with a sharp, glancing blow, they would strike the steel striker against the flint. This action shaved off tiny, white-hot particles of steel that would land on the charcloth, creating a glowing ember. This ember was then gently transferred into a nest of highly flammable tinder such as dried moss, birch bark, or tow fibers from flax and blown upon until it burst into flame. This entire process required practice, dexterity, and calm nerves, especially with cold, numb fingers. A dropped ember or a gust of wind could mean failure, so the tinderbox was a treasure guarded with care. The design of the hearth itself evolved to better manage this precious resource. In a peasant's cottage, the open central hearth was simple but problematic. The smoke hole in the roof was a compromise. It let smoke out, but it also let cold air, snow, and rain in. A clever innovation to solve this was the louver. This was a small, turret-like structure built on the roof, topped with a slatted, movable cap. The slats allowed smoke to escape while blocking precipitation, and the cap could be adjusted with a pole from below to control the draft, helping the fire burn more efficiently. In castles and wealthier homes, the fireplace represented a major architectural advancement. Built into the wall with a stone or brick chimney, it drew air more effectively, creating a stronger draft that pulled smoke up and away from the living space. This design concentrated heat into the room rather than letting it vanish into the rafters. Some sophisticated castle fireplaces even included a smoke bay, a recessed area above the fire that helped trap smoke before it could escape into the room. The mastery of fire was therefore a complex interplay of long-term planning, daily ritual, and clever technology. It was a constant dance with a dangerous but essential partner, a dance where a single misstep could have frozen consequences. But even with a roaring fire and a sturdy shelter, the body needs fuel to generate its own internal warmth. Securing enough food to last through the long, barren months was perhaps the most pressing anxiety of medieval life. Without the luxury of refrigeration or a global supply chain, communities had to become masters of preservation, turning the abundance of autumn into a lifeline that would stretch across the frozen landscape of winter. The entire seasonal rhythm was dictated by this imperative. The approach of winter was marked not by a change in the weather alone, but by a flurry of deliberate, coordinated activity centered on the Martinmas slaughter. Around the feast of St. Martin in early November, a somber but necessary task began on every farmstead. The majority of the livestock, particularly pigs and cattle that could not be fed through the winter, were butchered. This was not a casual affair, it was a calculated culling. Only the breeding stock and the strongest animals were spared. The immediate result was a temporary surplus of fresh meat, a brief period of feasting before the real work began. The clock was now ticking. This massive quantity of meat had to be processed quickly before spoilage set in, leading to a symphony of preservation techniques that transformed perishable flesh into stable winter provisions. The most widespread method was salting. Salt was a precious commodity, sometimes worth its weight in gold, because it was the key to survival. The meat, often large sides of pork or beef, was heavily rubbed with coarse salt or packed in layers within barrels, each layer separated by a thick bed of salt. The salt acted by drawing out the moisture from the meat through a process called osmosis. Bacteria and fungi, which cause rot, cannot thrive without water, so by dehydrating the meat, the salt created an environment where it could not spoil. For even greater security, especially for cuts like ham and bacon, salting was followed by smoking. The meat would be hung high in the chimney or in a specially built smokehouse, where it was exposed to the slow, cool smoke from smoldering hardwoods like oak or hickory. This smoke deposited a layer of chemicals on the surface of the meat that further inhibited bacterial growth, while also imparting that rich, distinctive flavor we still associate with smoked meats today. The final product was rock hard, leathery, and could last for many months. Before cooking, it required a long soaking to rehydrate and remove excess salt, but it provided essential protein when the land offered nothing. For quicker consumption or for travelers, meat was often made into jerky by simply drying it in strips in the air or over a very low fire. Grains, the cornerstone of the medieval diet, presented a different challenge. A successful harvest was meaningless if the grain could not be stored without succumbing to mold or being devoured by rats and insects. The solution was the granary. This was not just a simple shed. It was a carefully designed structure, often raised from the ground on stone saddle stones or mushroom-shaped posts. These stones acted as a barrier, preventing dampness from rising from the soil and making it difficult for rodents to climb up. The building itself was designed to be well ventilated, allowing air to circulate and keep the grain dry. The wealth of a lord was often measured not just in land, but in the number of granaries he possessed, bulging with the wheat, rye, and barley that would be ground into flour for the dark, hearty bread that sustained everyone. For root vegetables like turnips, carrots, parsnips, and cabbages, a remarkably simple yet effective underground technology was used, the clamp. After harvest, these vegetables were taken to a dry, well-drained spot. A layer of straw was laid down to act as insulation from the cold ground, and the vegetables were piled into a large mound or ridge. This mound was then covered with another thick layer of straw, and finally, the entire structure was encased in a shell of earth dug from around it. This earthen blanket protected the vegetables from frost, while the straw allowed for just enough air circulation to prevent rot. The clamp acted as a natural refrigerator, maintaining a cool, stable temperature that kept the vegetables in a state of suspended animation throughout the winter. When a meal was needed, a section of the clamp would be opened, vegetables retrieved, and the whole carefully sealed back up to protect the remaining store. For the nobility, however, there was an even more advanced method of defying the seasons, the ice house. This was a technology of almost magical sophistication, a testament to both wealth and engineering ingenuity. During the coldest days of winter, servants would venture out onto the frozen lakes and ponds on the estate to harvest ice. Using saws and axes, they would cut large, clear blocks of ice, which were then transported to a specially constructed ice house. This was not a simple shed. It was an architectural marvel designed for one purpose: to keep ice frozen through the summer. Typically, it was a deep underground pit, often lined with brick or stone, and topped with a domed, above-ground structure that was heavily insulated with materials like straw, turf, or even sawdust. The ice blocks were carefully stacked inside the pit, and each layer was packed with more insulating straw. The thick walls and the insulating layer trapped the cold air inside, while the underground location kept the chamber cool. A drainage channel at the bottom allowed meltwater to escape without soaking the remaining ice. A well-managed ice house could preserve ice for a year or more. This ice was not just a novelty. It was a practical tool for preserving perishable foods like fish and dairy products in the warmer months. But it also allowed for a rare luxury: the creation of chilled desserts and cooled drinks during a summer heat wave, a dazzling display of power that demonstrated a lord's ability to command the very weather itself, turning the harshness of winter into a summer delight. Even with a larder full of salted meat and a granary stocked with grain, the winter was long and unpredictable. A bad harvest, an unexpected siege, or simply a larger family to feed could quickly deplete those carefully hoarded reserves. This meant that survival often hinged on the ability to venture into the frozen world and wrest additional sustenance from it directly. The deep snows that isolated communities also transformed the landscape into a vast, stark ledger of life, making winter a unique and perilous season for the hunter. The same blanket of white that concealed the land's contours revealed the movements of every creature that dared to traverse it. A fresh snowfall acted as a reset, and the first tracks to appear were like a message written in a language only the experienced could read. A hunter could follow the delicate, paired prints of a hare, the heavier, rounded impressions of a roe deer, or the distinctive, cloven-hoofed trail of a wild boar with a clarity impossible in other seasons. Tracking, however, was only the first step. The real challenge lay in the pursuit itself. While the snow revealed the prey, it also hampered the hunter's movement. Struggling through deep drifts was exhausting work, burning precious calories and making a silent approach nearly impossible. The solution was not brute force, but adaptation. Hunters would fashion makeshift snowshoes from pliable branches, often birch or willow, lashing them into a rough oval frame crisscrossed with raw leather thongs. These widely distributed the hunter's weight, allowing them to glide atop the snow crust that would otherwise swallow them whole. a technique learned through observation and necessity. For larger game like deer or the formidable wild boar, the strategy often shifted from stalking to ambush, knowing that animals were forced to follow predictable paths to reach their few remaining food sources, such as stands of evergreen trees where they could browse on needles or bark. Hunters would establish blinds downwind. They might construct a simple hide of piled snow and branches, and then wait, sometimes for hours in the biting cold, for their quarry to appear. This required immense patience and fortitude, a test of will against the cold as much as a test of skill against the animal. The desperation of the hunt was a two-way street. The animals themselves were starving, their fat reserves depleted, making them more aggressive and unpredictable. A cornered boar was, and still is, one of the most dangerous animals in the European forest. A medieval boar hunt was not a genteel pastime, but a grim, close-quarters battle for survival. Hunters relied on spears, their long reach offering a slight advantage against the boar's slashing tusks, and they often worked in teams with trained dogs to corner the beast. The stakes could not have been higher. Success meant weeks of additional food, while failure could mean serious injury or death in a landscape where even a minor wound could become a death sentence. Smaller game, like the snowshoe hare, was a more attainable but still vital prize. Their white winter coats provided excellent camouflage, but their movements between feeding grounds were regular. Snares made from twisted horsehair or gut were set along these runs. This passive hunting method was efficient, allowing a hunter to set multiple traps and check them daily, conserving energy while still providing a steady, if modest, supply of fresh meat. A single hare might not feed a family, but its meat was lean and its pelt could be used to line gloves or hats, adding another tiny layer of protection against the cold. Beyond the hunt, the winter forest and field held other, quieter treasures for those who knew where to look. While the vibrant greens of summer were a memory, many plants entered a dormant state, preserving their nutritional value in concentrated forms. Foraging in winter was a subtler art, a search for hidden pockets of sustenance that could make a critical difference to health. The most significant threat during these barren months, especially for the poor whose diet was heavily based on grains and salted meat, was scurvy. This debilitating disease, caused by a lack of vitamin C, would bring on lethargy, swollen gums, and open wounds, slowly sapping a person's strength. Without understanding the biochemistry, medieval people knew from hard experience that certain plants could prevent or alleviate these symptoms. Bright red rose hips, the fruit of the wild rose, were a winter lifeline. After the first frost, these berries would soften and sweeten, clinging to the bare, thorny stems throughout the season. They were packed with vitamin C and would be harvested and boiled into a tart, nutritious tea or mashed into a rough paste. Similarly, clusters of deep purple elderberries, though often harvested in autumn, could sometimes be found preserved on the bush. Nuts, like acorns from oak trees or beech nuts, were another crucial resource. While many were gathered in the autumn, a careful forager could often find overlooked caches or those buried by squirrels. Acorns, however, required knowledge to prepare. They contain bitter tannins that must be leached out by soaking or boiling in multiple changes of water before they can be ground into a coarse, nutritious flour. Perhaps the most surprising foraged remedy came not from a berry, but from the bark of a tree. The inner bark of the pine tree, known as the cambium layer, is rich in vitamins and sugars. In a true survival situation, strips of this pale, fibrous bark could be scraped away and eaten raw, or dried and ground into a flour additive. More commonly, fresh pine needles themselves would be steeped in hot water to make a fragrant, citrusy tea that is remarkably high in vitamin C. This knowledge of the forest's pharmacy was folk wisdom at its most vital. A parent gathering a handful of rose hips or brewing a pot of pine needle tea was unknowingly engaging in a battle against an invisible foe, using the land's own resilience to bolster their families. This combination of the aggressive pursuit of game and the quiet, meticulous gathering of wild plants represents the two sides of medieval winter survival: the bold, dangerous confrontation with nature's predators, and the humble, patient gathering of its hidden medicines. Both were essential threads in the fabric of endurance. Yet even with a full larder and a warm hearth, the demands of life, a message for a distant lord, a desperate need for medicine, a trade that could not wait until spring, could force a person out into the white void. Winter travel was a terrifying gamble, a venture where a single wrong turn could lead to a frozen grave. The very infrastructure that connected communities vanished beneath the snow. What passed for roads in the medieval period were little more than dirt tracks, and these became treacherous traps. Deep, unconsolidated snow could swallow a horse up to its chest, breaking legs and immobilizing travelers. More insidious was the hidden ice, a thin, invisible layer under a dusting of snow that could send a mount and rider crashing to the ground in an instant. The isolation we spoke of earlier was not a passive state. It was an active barrier, a wall of snow and silence that made a journey of 10 miles as daunting as a voyage across a frozen sea. In such a landscape, conventional navigation was useless. There were no detailed maps for the common traveler, and even if there were, a featureless expanse of white renders any map a meaningless abstraction. Success depended instead on a deep, intuitive understanding of the natural world, a skill set honed by generations of wayfarers. The sun, even when weak and pale, became the most reliable guide. Its low arc across the southern sky provided a constant directional marker. A traveler moving east or west would keep the sun on their left or right shoulder respectively, using its predictable journey to maintain a straight course. But the sun was a fleeting partner, visible for only a few precious hours. When it vanished, the celestial map of the night sky took over. While the complex science of astronomy was the domain of scholars, the practical knowledge of the stars was a vital tool for survival. The North Star, Polaris, was the unwavering anchor point. Unlike other stars that appear to move across the heavens, Polaris holds a fixed position almost directly above the Earth's North Pole. Finding it was a matter of life and death. Travelers would locate the Big Dipper or the Plow and follow an imaginary line upwards from the 2 stars at the end of its bowl directly to the bright, steady light of Polaris. Keeping that star ahead or behind them, depending on their intended direction, gave them a true north that could not be obscured by snowdrifts or shifting landscapes. The Earth itself offered more immediate, though subtler, clues. An experienced traveler learned to read the snow itself. Wind sculpts snow into distinct formations called drifts. By observing the shape and orientation of these drifts around familiar objects like lone trees, large rocks, or fence posts, one could determine the prevailing wind direction. In many regions, winds blow consistently from the west or southwest. Therefore, a large, smooth slope on the eastern side of a tree and a steep, overhanging face on the western side indicated a westerly wind. This knowledge served as a natural compass long after the wind had died down, providing a constant, silent reference point etched into the very terrain. Landmarks took on an exaggerated importance. A distinctive, gnarled oak tree on a hilltop, a peculiar rock formation, the specific bend of a frozen river, these were the signposts of the medieval traveler. Knowing the sequence of these landmarks was crucial. Passing the 3rd large standing stone after the fork in the valley meant you were still on the right path toward the monastery. This was a mental map, passed on through oral tradition and personal experience, where every hill and copse had a name and a story attached to it. To aid in this perilous navigation, communities invested in creating permanent waymarkers. In open, featureless terrain like moors, mountain passes, or wide valleys, cairns, deliberate piles of stones, were built at regular intervals. These were not haphazard rock piles. They were carefully constructed monuments of survival. Their height and breadth made them visible even after a heavy snowfall, and their placement was strategic, often on high ground to be seen from a distance. In particularly treacherous areas, such as mountain passes, a series of cairns would be placed within sight of each other, creating a dotted line of safety across the white wilderness. A traveler caught in a sudden white out could stumble from one cairn to the next, using them as lifelines to avoid straying into a crevasse or over a cliff. Similarly, wayside crosses, often carved with religious iconography, served a dual purpose. They offered a place for prayer and spiritual solace for the anxious traveler, but they were also supremely practical. Erected at crossroads or the entrance to a dangerous stretch of path, these crosses were unmistakable landmarks. Their verticality and dark stone stood in stark contrast to the horizontal whiteness, making them visible markers of a safe route. In the deepest silence of a winter forest, the sight of a familiar wayside cross was as comforting as the glow of a distant window, a sure sign that human presence and the path to shelter were near. Yet all the practical skills in the world, the warmest wool, the sturdiest shelter, the most secure fire, could not defend against an invisible enemy that seeped into the mind during the long, dark months. The physical battle against the cold was matched by a profound psychological struggle against isolation and despair. Imagine the world shrinking to the four walls of a smoky cottage, the sun a pale, brief visitor for only a few hours a day, followed by 16 hours of impenetrable darkness broken only by the flickering of a single flame. This unending twilight, combined with the oppressive silence of a snow-blanketed landscape, created a breeding ground for what we might now recognize as severe seasonal depression. For the medieval mind, this weight on the soul was often interpreted as a spiritual trial, a period of stagnation sent by God to test their faith and resilience. The fight to maintain morale was, therefore, not a luxury but a critical component of survival, as vital as any store of food. This mental battle was fought and won not by individuals, but by the community. The very structure of medieval life was inherently collective, and this interdependence became a lifeline in winter. The concept of a nuclear family struggling alone was almost unheard of in village society. Instead, life was lived in a tight-knit web of extended family and neighbors. When a storm threatened, it was not each household for itself. Villagers would work together to secure animals in a common barn, check on the elderly and infirm to ensure their fires were banked and their larders sufficient, and share the labor of digging out paths between cottages. This mutual aid was a practical necessity, but its psychological benefit was immense. The simple act of seeing another face, of sharing a complaint about the weather or a worry about the livestock, reaffirmed that one was not alone in the struggle. The sound of another human voice cut through the isolating silence, a powerful reminder of shared humanity. Within the home, the long evenings forced indoors became a time for activities that sustained the spirit. With light for detailed work limited to the daylight hours, the dim firelight hours were dedicated to crafts that could be done by touch and memory. Women would spin wool or flax, the rhythmic turning of the spindle, a meditative, productive act that transformed raw fiber into the thread of future garments. Men might carve wooden utensils or repair tools, their hands staying busy even as their minds engaged in conversation. This was not idle busy work. It was a way to assert control and purpose in a season that otherwise felt stagnant. The tangible progress of a growing ball of yarn or a newly smoothed bowl provided a small but significant sense of accomplishment, a counterpoint to the frozen world outside. The most powerful weapon against the darkness, however, was the human voice. Storytelling was the cinema and literature of the age. Grandparents, repositories of family and local history, would recount tales of past winters survived, of legendary storms, of encounters with mythical creatures like the wild hunt said to ride the winter winds. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained the children, passed down crucial survival lore in a memorable narrative form, and subtly reinforced the message that previous generations had endured worse and persevered. Music, too, was a common solace. A simple flute, a drum made from a stretched skin, or even just the sound of singing together could transform a cramped, dark room. The melodies, often old folk songs or hymns, created a bubble of warmth and shared emotion, lifting hearts and strengthening the bonds between those huddled around the hearth. These communal activities were a deliberate defiance of the season's gloom, a way to create light and connection from within. The calendar itself was strategically designed to provide psychological relief. The Church, understanding the human need for hope and celebration, placed major festivals at the darkest times of the year. Christmas was not just a religious observance, it was a crucial psychological milestone. The Advent season built anticipation during the deepening dark of December, culminating in a feast that, even for the poorest, meant a special meal, a break from work, and a celebration of light and rebirth. The 12 days of Christmas provided a structured period of festivity, gatherings, and goodwill that forcibly interrupted the winter's monotony. Following this, Candlemas on February 2nd marked another critical turning point. This festival, celebrating the presentation of Jesus at the temple, was deeply intertwined with the promise of returning light. It was traditional to bless all the candles to be used in the church for the coming year, and the liturgy itself spoke of Christ as a light to lighten the Gentiles. For the common person, Candlemas was the day when the winter half of the year was considered truly over. It was a moment to look forward, to believe that the worst was past and that the slow march toward spring was undeniable. These festivals acted as beacons on the long winter timeline, giving people specific dates to anticipate and rally around, structuring the seemingly endless cold into manageable segments, and providing a narrative of hope and eventual renewal that was essential for mental survival. Even with the strongest community bonds and the most resilient spirit, the medieval body was frighteningly vulnerable to the cold's most direct assaults. All the preparation in the world could not always prevent an accident, a missed turn, or a sudden storm that led to prolonged exposure. When the cold began to win the battle, turning living flesh into a cold, numb liability, medieval medicine stepped in with a mixture of observed wisdom, desperate improvisation, and often, brutal necessity. Their understanding of conditions like frostbite and hypothermia was framed not by modern biochemistry, but by the humoral theory inherited from the ancient Greeks. The body was seen as a balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was a state of balance, and illness and imbalance often caused by external factors. Extreme cold was understood to cause an excess of cold and moist phlegm, literally chilling the body's vital spirits and slowing the blood to a dangerous crawl. The earliest signs of what we call hypothermia would have been chillingly familiar. It began not with dramatic shivering, but with a creeping lethargy and confusion that was deceptively dangerous. A traveler who had been walking for hours might suddenly feel overwhelmingly tired, deciding to sit down against a tree for just a moment's rest. To a companion, this person might seem uncooperative or strangely quiet, their speech slurred as if intoxicated. This was the body shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core warmth, but to the medieval mind, it could appear as a loss of will or even the influence of malevolent spirits of the frost. The profound, uncontrollable shivering that precedes this stage was likely interpreted as the body's natural struggle to generate heat, a sign that the vital forces were still fighting. The real danger came when the shivering stopped, signaling that the body's defenses were failing. Without understanding the precise mechanics of dropping core temperature, healers knew this was a critical turning point. The priority was to rewarm the core, but their methods were a precarious dance that could easily do more harm than good. The instinct to place a half-frozen person directly next to a roaring fire was strong, yet many medieval texts caution against this very practice. There was a folk understanding that applying intense heat to a frozen body could be lethal. Instead, the recommended treatment involved a gradual, gentle restoration of warmth. The victim would be moved to a sheltered area, their wet clothing carefully removed and replaced with dry blankets or even the body heat of others lying beside them. Warm but not hot, drinks such as mulled ale or broth would be administered slowly to help raise internal temperature. Rubbing the limbs was also common, though this could be dangerously abrasive if frostbite had already set in. The goal was to coax the life back into the person, not to shock their system. In monasteries or wealthier households, herbal remedies might be employed. Plants like ginger or mustard, known for their heating properties, could be added to drinks or poultices in an attempt to stimulate circulation and restore the body's natural heat, according to humoral principles. Frostbite, the localized freezing of tissue, was a more visible and gruesome adversary. The progression was stark. It started with a painful prickling sensation, then advanced to a dead numbness as the fluids in the skin and underlying tissues actually began to freeze, forming tiny ice crystals that shredded cells from within. The affected area, most commonly fingers, toes, the nose, and ears, would turn first deathly white, then waxy and hard to the touch. As it thawed, the true damage was revealed. The skin might blister terribly, turning a dark purple or black as the tissue died from a lack of blood flow. This process, known as gangrene, was the medieval surgeon's signal that a part of the body was lost. They had no concept of bacteria, but they understood that this, mortification or death of flesh, was a creeping poison that could spread to the rest of the body, leading to a painful, feverish death. This is where medieval medicine turned from care to grim intervention. The application of salves was the first line of defense against frostbite. These were not simple moisturizers. They were complex formulations designed to draw out the cold poison and restore balance. A typical salve might be based on goose grease, badger fat, or lard, which provided a protective, insulating barrier. Into this base, herbs with warming or antiseptic properties would be mixed. Garlic, thyme, or woundwort were common choices, believed to cleanse the wound and stimulate healing. For milder cases, this gentle external application, combined with careful rewarming, might be enough to save the tissue, though the victim would likely be left with permanent nerve damage and disfigurement. But when the blackness of gangrene set in, there was only one known cure: amputation. This was a harrowing, last resort procedure performed without anesthetics beyond perhaps a strong dose of alcohol or opium. The tools were rudimentary: a saw, a knife, and a cautery iron heated in the fire. The surgeon's priority was speed, to minimize the unimaginable pain and the risk of the patient bleeding to death. A tourniquet would be applied above the affected area, and the limb would be swiftly severed. The stump was then cauterized with a hot iron to seal the blood vessels, a horrific but necessary step to prevent fatal hemorrhaging. The survival rate from such an ordeal was low, due to shock, blood loss, and almost inevitable infection from non-sterile instruments. An amputation was a testament to the brutal calculus of medieval survival. The loss of a hand or a foot was a catastrophic disability, but it was preferable to the certain death brought by gangrene. It was a desperate gamble taken in the faint hope that the body's own strength, perhaps aided by prayer and careful nursing, could overcome the trauma. But beyond the need for food and warmth, the human body has a more immediate and non-negotiable requirement: water. In the heart of winter, this most basic element of life transforms into a deceptive and deadly opponent. The landscape might be blanketed in a seemingly endless supply of frozen water, but this abundance is a cruel illusion. The single most dangerous mistake a thirsty, cold individual can make is to succumb to the temptation of eating snow directly. It seems logical: you are thirsty, and there is the water right in front of you. But this act is a silent killer. The body must expend a massive amount of precious energy to melt that frozen mass in the stomach, energy that is being desperately conserved to maintain core body temperature. Every mouthful of snow is like swallowing a handful of cold calories, actively sucking the warmth from your own core and dramatically increasing the risk of hypothermia. Furthermore, snow is not pure water. It can contain dirt, bacteria, or other impurities from the air and ground. Eating it raw is not just inefficient, it is a direct pathway to a frozen grave. The only safe way to convert snow into life-giving water is through the application of controlled heat, a process that requires both patience and foresight. The technique is deceptively simple, but must be done correctly to be effective. You do not simply dump a large pot full of snow onto a roaring fire. A pot packed with dense snow will initially absorb the fire's heat to melt, but the bottom layer will melt first, and if the snow above is packed too tightly, it can create an insulating air pocket that causes the bottom of the pot to scorch or even melt, ruining the vessel. The proper method is to start with a small amount of snow in the bottom of a metal pot or cauldron. As this begins to melt over the fire, you gradually add more handfuls of snow, slowly building up the volume of water. This gradual addition ensures the existing water conducts the heat evenly, melting the new snow efficiently without risking damage to the container. For a medieval traveler with a limited fire, this was a slow, meticulous ritual. The reward at the end was not just water, but warm water, which could provide a crucial internal boost to a chilled body, a tiny victory in the daily war against the cold. Securing water was not just a concern for those caught in the wilderness. It was a central, daily challenge for every settled community. The village well, the primary source of water for drinking, cooking, and cleaning, became a potential death trap. Each morning, someone, often the women and children of the household, faced the dangerous chore of fetching water. The stone lip of the well would be coated in a slick, invisible layer of ice. The rope, stiff and frozen, could burn bare hands with its cold, but the greatest obstacle was the well itself. The surface of the water would freeze solid, sometimes to a depth of several inches, sealing the liquid below behind a formidable barrier of ice. Smashing through this ice with an axe or a heavy rock was risky. A misaimed strike could damage the well's structure or send sharp shards flying. A more common and ingenious method was the use of heated stones. A smooth, fist-sized river rock would be left in the hearth overnight to absorb warmth. In the morning, it would be carefully wrapped in a rag or held with tongs, carried to the well, and lowered on the end of the rope until it made contact with the ice. The sizzling sound of the hot stone meeting the ice was a familiar morning melody in a medieval village. The stone would melt through the ice, creating a hole that could be widened and maintained throughout the day. This simple act, repeated in countless villages across Europe, was a perfect example of medieval problem solving, using the heat of the hearth to defeat the cold of the well, turning a potentially catastrophic problem into a manageable daily task. For those living near a pond or a slow-moving stream, the challenge was similar but on a larger scale. Breaking a hole in the ice to access water for livestock or for washing was heavy labor. Here, the heated stone technique was scaled up. A larger, flatter rock would be heated in a strong fire until it was glowing hot. Using a pair of green wood poles as makeshift tongs, 2 people would carry the stone and place it directly on the thick ice. The intense heat would not just melt a hole, it could crack the surrounding ice, making it easier to break apart and clear away. This method was also used by fishermen who needed to access their nets set beneath the ice. The constant need to manage frozen water sources meant that the control of fire was not just about warmth and cooking. It was intrinsically linked to hydration. The hearth was the engine that unlocked the frozen world, transforming solid menace into liquid life, one carefully heated stone at a time. This relentless, daily negotiation with ice and water was a fundamental rhythm of winter survival, a testament to the fact that in a frozen world, the most basic acts of life required strategy, effort, and a deep respect for the dangers of the cold. While the human struggle against winter was a story of wool, fire, and ingenuity, it's crucial to remember that medieval survival was a partnership. A peasant's life was inextricably linked to the well-being of their animals. The livestock were not mere property but fellow survivors, their fates woven together in a delicate dance of mutual dependence. The approach of winter, therefore, triggered a mass migration of beasts from the open fields to the heart of the home itself. For the vast majority of rural families, their one-room cottage was designed with a lower, darker section, often slightly recessed into the ground, dedicated to housing the most vital animals. This was not a separate barn but an integrated space, a shared living area where the breaths of cow, sheep, and human mingled in the smoky air. Bringing livestock inside was a carefully calculated decision with profound implications. The most obvious benefit was protection for the animals themselves. A cow or a sheep left outside in a deep freeze would quickly succumb to exposure or become easy prey for wolves and other predators driven desperate by hunger. But the advantages were deeply reciprocal. The body heat generated by a few animals, even a couple of sheep or a milk cow, significantly raised the temperature of the entire dwelling. On a frigid night, the warmth radiating from a large animal could mean the difference between a manageable chill and a lethal drop in temperature for the human family, sleeping just a few feet away. Furthermore, the animal's presence provided a constant, ready supply of manure, which, while pungent, was a valuable resource. It could be regularly collected and added to the compost pile, ensuring a rich fertilizer for the spring planting, a small but vital investment in the future. The management of these indoor animals was a precise science born of necessity. The animal area was typically separated from the human living space by a low partition, or simply a change in the floor level, but there was no true barrier. The sounds and smells of the barnyard were a constant feature of winter life. Feeding routines changed dramatically. The summer diet of fresh grass was replaced by carefully hoarded winter fodder, hay that had been cut and dried in the summer sun, and straw, the dried stalks from the grain harvest. Every mouthful was measured, as the supply had to last until the pastures turned green again. Water was another critical concern. Melting snow for a family was laborious enough. Providing daily water for a cow required a major and continuous effort, making that morning trip to the cracked open well a task of supreme importance. For the wealthier peasant or a manor lord, livestock were housed in more specialized structures known as byres or cattle sheds. These were sturdy buildings, often located close to the main dwelling for security and ease of access. Their design prioritized warmth and ventilation, a difficult balance to strike. They needed to be draft-free to protect the animals from the direct wind, but also well enough ventilated to prevent the buildup of moisture and ammonia from urine, which could lead to respiratory diseases. The floors were often made of stone or packed earth, covered with a deep, absorbent layer of straw or bracken. This bedding served as insulation from the frozen ground and as a sponge for waste. As it became soiled, new layers of fresh straw were added on top, creating a compostable mattress that would be cleared out in the spring to become valuable manure for the fields. This deep litter system was a brilliant piece of sustainable farming, turning a problem of winter waste into an asset for future growth. Among the most crucial animals were the powerful oxen, the living tractors of the medieval world. A team of oxen represented a massive investment for a village or a lord, and their survival through the winter was non-negotiable for the spring plowing that would determine the next year's food supply. These immense creatures required a significant amount of fodder, and their care was a top priority. Their diet was supplemented with more nutritious grains or bean meal when available to keep their strength up. Similarly, horses, especially the valuable war horses of the nobility and the palfreys used for travel, received exceptional care. They were stabled in dedicated buildings, their coats regularly groomed to maintain the insulating properties of their fur, and their feed was often enhanced with oats to provide energy. A knight's ability to respond to a threat or a lord's capacity to administer his lands depended entirely on the health of his horses come the thaw. Hunting dogs, too, entered a period of carefully managed austerity. During the active hunting seasons of autumn, they were well fed on the offal and scraps of the kill. But in the lean winter months, their rations were reduced to conserve precious food supplies. They were kept close to the hearth or in sheltered kennels, their purpose shifting from active pursuit to simple survival. A healthy hound in the spring was a tool for putting meat on the table. A starved or frozen dog was a lost asset. This careful husbandry of animal partners highlights a fundamental truth of medieval life. Survival was a holistic endeavor. The warmth of the cow, the strength of the ox, and the keen nose of the hound were not separate from human endurance. They were integral threads in the same tapestry. The success of the entire community in the spring hinged on the success of protecting these vital creatures through the long, dark, and silent siege of winter. This simple, unspoken practice of shared body heat stands as one of the most fundamental and universal survival strategies of the medieval winter, a silent testament to human interdependence. While we've explored the layers of wool and the warmth of the hearth, the heat generated by the human body itself was a resource too vital to waste, especially during the long, sunless nights when temperatures could plunge to lethal depths. In an era without electric blankets or thermostats, the collective warmth of a family, or even a community, became a living furnace, a biological defense against the cold that seeped through cracks in the walls. This was not merely an act of closeness, it was a deliberate, calculated strategy for survival, as carefully planned as stacking firewood or salting meat. Historical records and architectural evidence paint a clear picture of this necessity. For the vast majority of the population living in 1 or 2 room cottages, the entire household, parents, children, grandparents, and even unmarried aunts or uncles, would sleep together in the main room, often on a single large mattress stuffed with straw or a collection of smaller pallets pushed tightly together. This was the standard arrangement, not just for harsh nights, but for every night of the year. The body heat from several individuals sleeping side by side created a microclimate under the shared blankets, a pocket of warmth that was significantly higher than the ambient air of the room, which itself might be barely above freezing by the early hours of the morning. The very young and the very old, who were most vulnerable to hypothermia, were typically placed in the center of this human huddle, surrounded by the stronger heat sources of the adults. The practicality was absolute. It conserved the finite resource of bodily energy, allowing everyone to rest more deeply and wake with the strength needed for another day of labor in the cold. During particularly severe, cold snaps or famines, when firewood was scarce or the winter was unrelenting, this practice could expand beyond the immediate family. It was not uncommon for servants or agricultural laborers who lived on a farmstead to bring their own sleeping pallets into the main hall of the manor house or the principal cottage, creating a large, communal sleeping area. In monastic communities, the monks slept in a common dormitory, their individual cells often being too cold for safe rest during the winter. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed life in many monasteries, even had provisions for the arrangement of beds to ensure modesty, but the underlying reality was that the communal life provided a physical buffer against the elements. This collective approach to warmth highlights a medieval mindset that stands in stark contrast to our modern emphasis on privacy. Survival superseded solitude. The constant physical proximity and the lack of personal space were simply facts of life, accepted as the price of seeing another spring. Beyond the immediate family unit, there are accounts and suggestive evidence of even broader communal arrangements in times of extreme crisis. In villages struck by particularly brutal winters or after a disaster like a fire that left families homeless, the entire community might consolidate. The largest and most weather-tight building, often the church or the manor hall, could become a temporary shelter, with multiple families bedding down together in the same large space. While historical documents don't often detail the nightly sleeping arrangements of peasants, the logic of survival makes it clear that in a life or death situation, old social boundaries would have softened in the face of a shared threat. The warmth of a stranger lying next to you was still warmth, and in the deepest dark of a medieval winter, that simple physical fact could override all other considerations. This strategy was a powerful, tangible expression of the community's role as a mutual aid society, where the collective body became the final, most reliable line of defense against the cold. While the shared warmth of a family huddled together was a vital strategy, medieval ingenuity also produced specialized tools to deliver targeted heat right where it was needed most. Beyond the roaring hearth and the heat of livestock, people developed clever portable devices to combat the pervasive chill, particularly at night when the body's temperature naturally drops and the fire was banked to a mere glow. Anyone who has climbed into a cold, damp bed on a winter's night knows the shuddering discomfort of it. In a medieval home, where bedding was often straw-filled and dampness seeped from the walls, this experience was magnified into a genuine health risk. The solution was a simple yet brilliant contraption known as a bed warmer or a panacea. This was not a complex machine, but a testament to practical design. Imagine a long-handled pan, much like a small frying pan, but with a perforated lid and often made of brass or copper for efficient heat conduction. Before retiring for the night, a member of the household would fill this pan with hot embers from the banked fire, carefully scooping glowing coals into its basin. They would then close the perforated lid, which served the dual purpose of containing the embers and allowing heat to radiate outwards safely. The ritual of using the bed warmer was a familiar evening chore. The person would then slowly and methodically run the pan between the sheets and blankets of each bed, moving it in a steady, sweeping motion. The radiant heat from the metal and the coals within would gently chase the damp, icy chill from the linen and wool, creating a pocket of welcoming warmth. This was a far more effective and safer method than using a hot stone directly, which could scorch the fabric. The long handle allowed the user to reach the foot of the bed without having to lean over it, and the lid prevented stray sparks from escaping and setting the highly flammable bedding alight, a constant and terrifying danger in a world lit by flame. In wealthier households, a servant might perform this task for the lord and lady, but in a peasant cottage, it would be a shared duty, each family member taking a turn to warm the communal sleeping space. The comforting hiss of the warm pan sliding through the sheets and the faint, smoky scent of the embers became a sensory hallmark of securing a safe and restful night's sleep against the cold. For personal warmth during the day, especially for those whose work kept them outdoors, the medieval equivalent of the modern hand warmer provided a crucial pocket-sized source of heat. These were often small, perforated metal boxes, crafted from tin or brass, with a hinged lid and a carrying chain. Like the bed warmer, their operation was straightforward. A few small pieces of charcoal, or more commonly, a special slow-burning fuel made from touchwood, a prepared, smoldering fungus, would be placed inside the box. The user would then carry it in a pocket, a muff, or simply hold it in their gloved hands. The perforations allowed just enough oxygen to keep the fuel smoldering for hours, producing a steady, gentle heat that could make the difference between functional fingers and the numb, useless claws that were the first step toward frostbite. A guardsman standing a long watch on a castle rampart, a scribe trying to keep the ink from freezing in his pot, or a traveler on a long journey would all have prized such a device. These hand warmers were personal treasures, often ornately decorated, reflecting the value placed on this simple yet life-preserving technology. Perhaps the most universally accessible heating tool, however, required no special crafting at all: the humble heated stone. This was a technology available to everyone, from the poorest peasant to the noble in his castle. The method was as old as fire itself. A smooth, fist-sized stone would be selected from a riverbed or stream. River stones were ideal because their smoothness prevented them from cracking under heat. This stone would be left in the edge of the hearth to heat slowly throughout the day. By evening, it would be radiating a deep, penetrating warmth. Using a pair of tongs or by wrapping it in a thick cloth like a rag or a fold of linen, the stone would be retrieved. It could then be used in a variety of ways. The most common was to simply wrap it securely and place it at the foot of the bed, where its heat would last for hours, warming the feet, a critical area for overall body warmth. But its uses were versatile. It could be held against the body to soothe aches from a day of labor in the cold, or placed on the lap while sitting near the fire to augment its warmth. For someone suffering from a chill, holding a wrapped warm stone was a direct and comforting way to drive the cold from their core. This simple act of harnessing the heat-retaining properties of stone demonstrates a profound understanding of the materials available in their environment, turning a common object into a powerful tool for daily comfort and survival. This remarkable ingenuity, this ability to see the enemy not just as an obstacle, but as a potential ally, extended far beyond the walls of a shelter. The medieval mind, honed by necessity, developed a sophisticated, almost intuitive understanding of snow's physical properties, learning to harness its unique characteristics in ways that transformed it from a menace into a multifunctional building material. They may not have understood the physics of trapped air molecules acting as a thermal barrier, but they knew from generations of experience that a thick layer of snow kept things warm. This practical knowledge was applied with brilliant creativity to solve a host of winter problems. One of the most immediate and widespread applications was the construction of temporary windbreaks. A howling wind is the great amplifier of cold, stripping heat from the body with terrifying efficiency through a process called convection. Whether for a soldier on watch, a shepherd with his flock, or a traveler taking a brief rest, Creating a barrier against this wind was a matter of urgent survival. And the most readily available material was the snow beneath their feet. Using shovels, shields, or even their own feet, they would pack snow into dense, solid blocks, much like the igloos of the Arctic, but in a simpler, linear form. These blocks were then stacked into a low wall, often in a curved or angled shape to deflect the wind rather than trying to stop it head-on. The beauty of a snow windbreak was its efficiency and speed. A single person could erect a chest-high wall in a matter of minutes, creating a pocket of still air on the leeward side that felt dramatically warmer. For a shepherd spending a day in an exposed field, building a semicircular snow wall around his position could make the difference between a tolerable vigil and a life-threatening exposure. This was snow engineering in its simplest, most vital form. This principle of using snow as insulation was also applied to more permanent structures. In villages throughout northern Europe, it was common practice during heavy snowfall to actively pile snow against the exterior walls of homes, barns, and even churches. This was not just an acceptance of the weather, it was a deliberate act of winterizing a building. A thick bank of snow, packed against the stone or wattle and daub foundation, served as an effective buffer against the penetrating ground frost. For a peasant living in a cottage with an earthen floor, this snow berm could slow the transfer of cold from the frozen ground into the living space, making the floor marginally less icy. For storage sheds and barns housing livestock, this added layer of insulation helped stabilize the internal temperature, protecting stored root vegetables from freezing solid and reducing the draft that could chill the animals. They were, in effect, giving their buildings a seasonal winter coat, using the environment itself to enhance the structure's defenses. The same logic was applied to the most vulnerable point of any building, the door. A simple wooden door, no matter how well crafted, was a major source of heat loss, with gaps around the edges letting in cruel drafts. The solution was to build a temporary anteroom or vestibule out of snow. By piling snow into high walls on either side of the doorway, they created a small, enclosed space one had to step into before entering the main building. This airlock-like structure acted as a thermal buffer. The cold air from outside was trapped in this small snow chamber first, preventing it from rushing directly into the warm interior when the main door was opened. It was a remarkably clever way to manage airflow and conserve the precious heat generated by the indoor hearth, demonstrating a grasp of basic thermodynamics learned through pure, practical experimentation. Perhaps the most fascinating application of this knowledge was the creation of simple ice cellars or snow pits for short-term food storage. While the wealthy had their sophisticated, year-round ice houses, the common person needed a way to keep food from spoiling for a few days or weeks, especially after a fresh kill or a large batch of cooking. The solution was to dig a pit deep into a snowdrift, ideally in a shaded area. The bottom of the pit would be lined with a layer of straw or clean branches for insulation, and then the food, perhaps a haunch of meat, a pot of stew, or some dairy products would be placed inside. The pit would then be covered with a wooden board or a large flat stone, and the whole thing was buried again under a thick layer of snow. This created a natural refrigerator that would maintain a temperature just below freezing, perfectly preserving the contents. The deeply buried snow maintained a stable thermal environment, protecting the food from both the alternating thaw and freeze cycles of the surface and from scavenging animals. This method allowed a family to preserve perishable goods without salt or smoke, enjoying a brief respite from the monotonous winter diet of hard bread and salted meat. It was a small luxury, but one made possible by a profound understanding of the frozen world around them. They didn't need to know the scientific term, thermal mass. They simply knew that the deep snow kept things cold in a stable, reliable way, and they used that knowledge to make their harsh winters a little more manageable. But even with the most ingenious snow shelter and a carefully tended fire, rescue was not guaranteed if no one knew you were there. The single most terrifying aspect of being stranded was the profound silence and invisibility imposed by the storm. Your world might shrink to the small circle of your shelter, while the world beyond, the world of potential rescuers, remained utterly unaware of your plight. In this situation, passive endurance was not enough. Survival became an active process of communication. You had to transform your silent pocket of safety into a beacon that could pierce the white veil and signal your presence to anyone within sight or sound. The medieval traveler, therefore, had to be a master of signaling, using a limited toolkit to create messages of desperation that nature itself was trying to smother. The most immediate and powerful signal available was fire, but its use as a distress beacon required careful strategy, not just a roaring blaze. A fire for warmth was kept small and controlled to conserve fuel, but a fire for rescue had to be a spectacle. The rule was simple but critical: smoke by day, flame by night. During daylight hours, a bright flame is easily lost against the snow and sky, but a column of dark, thick smoke can be seen for miles. To create this vital smoke, a traveler would need to alter the composition of their fire. Once a strong base of flames was established, they would deliberately add damp materials. Green, leafy branches, piles of wet moss, or even a clump of turf would smother the flames momentarily, creating a vast, choking plume of white or gray smoke. If available, oily rags or certain types of resinous pine could be tossed on to produce a darker, more visible black smoke. This column, rising steadily against the pale winter sky, was a universally understood cry for help, a man-made cloud shouting, "Here I am," to any searching eyes. As dusk fell, the strategy shifted entirely. The goal now was to create the brightest possible light. This meant feeding the fire with the driest, most resinous wood available, encouraging tall, leaping flames that would cast a flickering orange glow against the snow and the undersides of any low clouds. In the absolute blackness of a moonless winter night, even a single candle can be seen from a surprising distance. A large fire became a lighthouse in a sea of darkness. For a traveler with a horse, the saddle might contain a small pot of fat or oil. Pouring this over the fire would create a sudden, intense flare, a momentary burst of light that could attract attention if a potential rescuer was glancing in that direction. The challenge, of course, was the wind. A strong gale could scatter the smoke during the day or blow the flames flat at night, rendering the signal ineffective. The signaling fire, therefore, had to be positioned strategically, if possible, in a natural windbreak or on a slight rise to give its message the best chance of climbing above the chaotic winds and being seen. Beyond fire, sound was the other primary medium for cutting through the isolation. In an era before electronic communication, the human voice alone was woefully inadequate. It would be swallowed by the snow-muffled landscape in a matter of yards. The solution was to use an instrument to amplify the call. Nearly any traveler of means, especially a knight, merchant, or messenger, would carry some form of horn. This wasn't necessarily a giant, curling war horn like those seen in films, but often a simpler, more portable instrument made from a cow horn or, for the wealthy, crafted from metal. The sound it produced was a deep, mournful blast that could carry for a surprisingly long distance in the cold, dense air. The distress signal was not a melody, but a pattern. The universally recognized call was a series of 3 distinct blasts, repeated at regular intervals. 3 of anything, 3 shouts, 3 horn blows, 3 fires was a long-established signal of extreme emergency. This pattern served 2 purposes. It distinguished the sound from the random noises of the wind or wildlife, and it conserved the signaler's energy. Instead of blowing the horn continuously until exhaustion set in, they could sound the triple blast, wait, listen for a response, and then repeat. This rhythmic, intentional pattern was a language of desperation that any fellow human would understand. For those without a horn, ingenuity once again provided an answer. A metal object struck against another could produce a sharp, ringing sound that might carry. Banging a sword against a shield or a rock against a cooking pot created a percussive alarm. There are even accounts of people using a simple wooden staff to beat rhythmically on the hollow trunk of a frozen tree, using the tree itself as a resonating drum to send vibrations through the ground and air. The key, as with the horn, was the pattern. 3 strikes, a pause, then 3 strikes again. This created a signal that was clearly artificial, a deliberate communication cutting through the natural white noise of the winter world. The waiting between signals was a psychological trial in itself, a period of straining to hear any reply, a distant horn blast, a shout, the barking of dogs. That would confirm the signal had been received and hope was on the way. Perhaps the most elegant and underappreciated signaling method involved not fire or sound, but light itself specifically, reflected sunlight. On a clear day after a storm, when the sun shone brightly on the pristine snow, visibility could be excellent for searchers. The problem was making your specific location stand out from the blindingly reflective landscape. Here, the standard equipment of a knight or soldier became a life-saving tool. A polished shield, a helmet, or even a highly buffed piece of metal armor could be used as a heliograph. By angling the surface to catch the sun's rays, a traveler could project a dazzling flicker of light over great distances. This was not a steady beam, but a series of intentional flashes. By alternately revealing and covering the reflective surface with a hand or a piece of cloth, they could create a flashing signal. Just like the horn blasts, a pattern of 3 flashes was the goal. This speck of intense, man-made light, dancing across the snowfields or forest edges, was incredibly eye-catching. To a search party scanning the horizon, that tiny, brilliant flash would stand out against the passive reflection of the snow like a star in the night sky, pinpointing a location with an accuracy that smoke or sound could not always achieve. It was a silent, energy-efficient, and highly effective way to shout across the miles without uttering a word. Now, let's turn to a particularly stubborn and dangerous survival myth, one that persists even today. The idea that a good swig of strong alcohol was the medieval equivalent of a hand warmer. It's a tempting image, a shivering knight pulling a flask from his saddlebag and taking a deep draught to warm his bones. While it's absolutely true that alcohol was consumed, believing it was a deliberate warming strategy is a misunderstanding that could have been fatal. The sensation is a lie. When you drink alcohol, you feel a sudden flush of warmth spreading across your skin, particularly in your face and extremities. This feels comforting, and it's easy to interpret it as your body heating up, but physiologically, the exact opposite is happening. Alcohol is a vasodilator. It causes your peripheral blood vessels to widen. This pushes warm blood from your core out to the surface of your skin. That's the warmth you feel. It's the heat from your vital organs being recklessly distributed to the surface, where it is instantly radiated away into the cold air. In essence, alcohol sacrifices your core temperature for a fleeting sensation of skin-deep warmth. It's like taking the central heating fuel from the boiler room of your body and burning it on the front porch. For someone exposed to the cold, this process dramatically accelerates the onset of hypothermia. That comforting flush is actually your life force bleeding away into the wind. So if alcohol was such a physiological trap, why was it so ubiquitous? The answer lies not in its false promise of warmth, but in its very real provision of calories and comfort. In the caloric economy of survival, alcohol was a significant source of energy. The common daily drink for all classes, from peasant to lord, was ale, a weak, fermented grain beverage that was far safer to drink than often contaminated water. This small beer or ale was nutritious, containing carbohydrates and vitamins from the grains, and it provided essential hydration. For a laborer spending hours chopping wood or tending animals in the cold, the calories in a quart of ale were a genuine fuel. Stronger spirits like brandy or mead were more of a luxury, but they packed an even greater caloric punch. In a world where starvation was a constant winter threat, consuming calorie-dense alcohol was a way to supplement a meager diet. Beyond the calories, we cannot underestimate the profound psychological value of a drink. After a day of back-breaking labor in the biting cold, returning to a dark, smoky cottage, the act of sharing a warm ale or a sip of spirits was a powerful mental respite. Alcohol's effect as a depressant on the central nervous system would temporarily dull the aches of cold muscles and quiet the gnawing anxiety of survival. It lowered inhibitions and fostered a sense of camaraderie and momentary cheer around the hearth. In a life defined by hardship, this small escape was invaluable. It was a tool for morale, a brief vacation from the relentless pressure of the cold. For the medieval mind, it might have felt like it was warming the spirit, even if it was cooling the body. Therefore, alcohol's role was one of comfort and community, not of clinical thermoregulation. It was a psychological blanket, not a physical one, a small, risky luxury in a world that offered very few. While the ingenuity of medieval Europeans was formidable, to truly witness mastery over the frozen world, we must turn our gaze northward, to the cultures for whom deep snow and sub-zero temperatures were not an occasional siege, but a constant companion. The Scandinavians, particularly the Vikings and their ancestors, didn't just survive winter, they thrived in it, developing a suite of technologies and techniques so advanced that they allowed them to explore, trade, and raid across the North Atlantic. Their survival was built on a foundation of specialized knowledge, honed over millennia in one of Europe's most challenging environments. Perhaps their most iconic invention was the ski. For these northern peoples, skis were not a recreational device but an essential tool for mobility, as fundamental as a horse was to a knight. Archaeological finds, like the remarkably preserved 4,000-year-old Kalvträsk ski from Sweden, prove that skiing predates the Viking Age by thousands of years. These early skis were long and broad, often crafted from a single piece of pine wood, with a fur-lined binding to secure a leather boot. The true genius, however, lay in the application of animal skins. A strip of fur, typically from a pine marten or a seal, was fastened to the bottom of the ski with the hairs pointing backwards. This created a one-way surface. When the skier glided forward, the slick hairs lay flat, but when they pushed back to gain traction, the coarse hairs would grip the snow, preventing a backward slide. This allowed for efficient travel uphill as well as downhill, transforming the impassable winter landscape into a highway. Hunters could pursue elk and reindeer across deep snowfields with a speed and silence that gave them a tremendous advantage, turning the hunter into a ghostly, swift predator where others would be floundering waist-deep. This mastery of winter travel extended to the water as well, where they faced the equally deadly threat of freezing spray. The Viking longship is a symbol of maritime prowess, but its ability to withstand northern seas was rooted in a technique far more subtle than its sleek design: the art of sealing seams. When constructing a ship, the planks of the hull were not nailed tightly together, but were instead fastened to a flexible frame, creating a vessel that could twist and bend with the waves. The gaps between these planks, however, would be fatal if left open. The solution was a meticulous process called caulking. Artisans would take strands of animal wool, often from a sheep, and dip them in sticky, water-resistant pine tar. These tar-soaked ropes were then hammered deep into the seams between the planks. Once the ship was launched, the wool would absorb water and swell, forming a watertight seal that became even tighter as the wood itself swelled. This same principle of creating flexible, waterproof barriers was applied to their clothing. While they used wool and linen like their southern counterparts, they took insulation to another level with the use of animal furs, particularly reindeer pelts. Reindeer skin is uniquely adapted to the Arctic. Each hair is hollow, trapping air and providing exceptional insulation. A parka made from reindeer fur, worn with the fur facing inward, was so effective that it could keep a person warm in temperatures far below freezing, a technological marvel that enabled the exploration of ice-choked regions like Greenland and Iceland. On land, their architectural solutions were equally sophisticated. The classic image of a Viking longhouse is a majestic, freestanding structure, but in the deepest winter, a more clever and energy-efficient design came into play: the semi-subterranean dwelling. By excavating a large pit several feet into the earth, builders took advantage of the ground's natural insulation. The earth maintains a relatively stable temperature, far warmer than the freezing air in winter and cooler than the summer heat. On this sunken foundation, they would erect a sturdy timber frame with walls of turf, thick sod cut from the ground. A turf roof, often supported by large central posts, would complete the structure. The entire building was then essentially buried under a living blanket of soil and grass. From a distance, it might have looked like a small, snow-covered hill, but inside, it was a remarkably stable environment. The thick turf walls and roof provided incredible insulation, keeping heat in and the biting wind out. The main source of heat was a long, central fire pit, and the design often included a single, low entrance that acted as a cold trap, much like the snow anterooms we discussed earlier. Smoke would filter out through a hole in the roof, but the lack of large windows and the subterranean nature of the building meant that the heat from the fire, the animals often housed at one end of the longhouse, and the family itself was conserved with brilliant efficiency. This was not just a house, it was a climate-controlled refuge engineered for the long polar night. The Scandinavian diet also reflected a deep understanding of their environment, relying heavily on preservation methods that utilized the cold itself. While salting and smoking were used, they also practiced a form of fermentation that produced a stable, nutritious winter food source. Fish, particularly cod, was air-dried on large wooden racks called stockfish racks. The combination of cold, dry Arctic wind would desiccate the fish completely, creating a rock-hard staple that could be stored for years. To eat it, it had to be pounded with a mallet and then soaked for days, but it provided a vital source of protein. Another fascinating technique was the burial of food in permafrost or in specifically constructed underground storage pits lined with stone and insulated with grass and soil. This created a natural freezer where meat and dairy could be kept safely for months. Their entire way of life was a dialogue with the cold, an ongoing process of observing its properties and then turning those properties to their advantage. They saw the snow not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a material to be shaped, the freezing wind not just as a killer, but as a preserving agent. This specialized knowledge, passed down through generations, allowed them to build a society in a landscape that would have been uninhabitable to less adaptable cultures, proving that human resilience, when coupled with deep environmental wisdom, can flourish even at the very edge of the world. Yet all the personal ingenuity and village-level resilience we've explored could be swept aside by the grand and brutal machinery of war. For a medieval army on campaign, winter was not merely an inconvenience, it was an operational catastrophe, a force of nature that could dismantle the most powerful host more effectively than any enemy charge. The very concept of a winter campaign was, for much of the period, considered close to madness. A king or general's grand strategy was dictated not by political ambition alone, but by the relentless turning of the seasons. As the last leaves fell from the trees, the order would go out. The army was to go into winter quarters. This was not a suggestion, it was a matter of survival. The logistical nightmare of supplying thousands of men and horses in the field became impossible once the roads turned to icy quagmires, and the countryside was stripped bare. To keep an army mobile in deep snow was to invite mass starvation and desertion. The campaigning season effectively ended with the first hard frost, and the war entered a state of frozen suspension. The process of settling into winter quarters was a massive undertaking in itself, a race against the worsening weather. The ideal location was a defensible position with access to resources, a captured town, a friendly monastery, or a castle with sufficient outbuildings. Here, the army would dissolve from a single fighting force into a garrison community. Soldiers were billeted in whatever structures were available: barns, stables, church halls, and the homes of local inhabitants, often causing significant friction. The high command, the knights and nobles, would take the most comfortable quarters, while the common foot soldiers and support personnel crammed into whatever shelter could be found. The primary task immediately became securing an enormous supply of firewood. Trees for miles around would be felled by work parties, creating a stockpile that had to last for months. A single castle housing a few hundred men for a winter could consume an entire forest, the wood smoke from 1,000 fires hanging like a permanent cloud over the encampment. This peaceful hibernation, however, was a fiction. An army in winter quarters was a parasite on the land, and its hunger did not diminish. the carefully stockpiled supplies brought by wagon trains before the snows fell would inevitably run low. This is where survival blurred into a darker, more brutal reality: organized foraging, which was often indistinguishable from systematic pillaging. While commanders might issue orders against harming the local population, especially in friendly territory, the desperate need for food and fodder usually overrode such concerns. Patrols would range out from the camp, not to fight the enemy, but to strip the surrounding countryside of anything edible. Peasant villages, already stretched to their limit, would be visited by armed men demanding their hidden stores of grain, their livestock, and their winter fodder. Resistance was met with violence. For the common soldier, this was not wanton cruelty but a grim necessity. Taking the food meant they themselves could eat. For the local population, the arrival of an army in winter quarters, whether friend or foe, was often a death sentence, condemning them to starvation before the spring. The line between soldier and bandit became dangerously thin during these long, hungry months. For the individual knight or man at arms, survival in the field meant adapting their military kit to the cold. Plate armor, the pinnacle of personal protection, presented a unique and deadly problem in winter. Metal is an excellent conductor of cold. A steel breastplate left outdoors would quickly sap the body's heat on contact, risking instant frostbite. Wearing armor directly against the skin, or even over thin clothing, was a recipe for disaster. The solution lay in a piece of military equipment that was as vital for insulation as it was for protection: the gambeson. This was a thick, padded jacket, typically made from many layers of linen or wool cloth quilted together and stuffed with scrap cloth, rags, or even grass. Worn under the metal plates, the gambeson created a crucial insulating barrier. The dense, air-trapping padding prevented the cold metal from touching the skin and provided significant warmth on its own, much like a modern insulated jacket. In fact, for sentry duty or camp chores where the full harness was not needed, a knight might wear just his gambeson as a warm, durable outer garment. Its versatility made it a cornerstone of winter warfare. Beyond the gambeson, a soldier's personal winter gear was a matter of wealth and foresight. A well-prepared man at arms would have heavy, woolen cloaks and hoods to wear over his armor when not in immediate combat readiness. Mittens, often made of leather with a wool lining, were essential for handling cold metal weapons and reins without losing fingers to frostbite. Leather boots would be stuffed with straw or thick felt liners, and fur-lined caps were worn under helmets. The challenge of sleeping in the field was met with large, communal tents shared by several men, their shared body heat providing warmth, and the ground covered with layers of straw or pine boughs for insulation. For an army, enduring a winter in the field was a continuous battle of logistics and personal endurance, where the enemy was not the opposing army across the valley, but the silent, creeping cold that threatened to claim victory without ever drawing a sword. While the feudal lord relied on tapestries and the peasant on a shared hearth, there existed another world entirely, one that stood as a bastion of knowledge and surprising comfort against the winter's siege: the medieval monastery. Isolated in the countryside, these communities of monks were not merely spiritual retreats. They were meticulously engineered survival machines. Their daily life was a rigidly structured defiance of the seasonal darkness, transforming the challenges of winter into a period of focused productivity and spiritual reflection. Within their walls, the battle against the cold was fought with a combination of architectural genius, disciplined routine, and a profound commitment to preserving light, both the physical light of their candles and the intellectual light of civilization itself. The monastery's greatest advantage was its design. Unlike the single-room peasant cottage or the drafty great hall of a castle, a monastery was a complex of specialized buildings arranged around a central cloister garden. This layout was not accidental. It was a masterclass in environmental control. The church, the chapter house, the refectory, the dormitory, and the scriptorium were all connected by covered walkways, meaning a monk could move between his daily duties without ever having to step outside into the biting wind and snow. The buildings themselves were constructed with a permanence and thoughtfulness rare in the secular world. Thick stone walls provided immense thermal mass, slowly absorbing the weak winter sun's heat during the day and radiating it back throughout the night, stabilizing the internal temperature against the wild swings outside. But in some of the most advanced monastic institutions, particularly those following the Benedictine rule which emphasized care for the sick, an even more remarkable technology was sometimes employed: the hypocaust system. This was a direct inheritance from Roman engineering, a method of central heating that would seem miraculous to most medieval people. Beneath the floor of a special building, usually the infirmary where the old and ill monks were cared for, a series of stone pillars would support the floor tiles. In a cellar below, a furnace tended by a dedicated lay brother would burn continuously. The hot air and gases from this fire would circulate through the gaps between the pillars, heating the solid stone floor above to a gentle, consistent warmth. The heat would then rise through the room, creating a dry, hospitable environment essential for convalescence. Vents in the walls allowed the smoke to escape. For a monk suffering from a winter ague, lying on a warm floor in the infirmary was the height of medieval medical care, a tangible expression of the monastery's commitment to charity and its ability to harness ancient wisdom for the comfort of its inhabitants. The rhythm of monastic life, governed by the canonical hours of prayer, provided a psychological structure that was as vital as any physical warmth. The winter solstice might bring only a few hours of daylight, but the monastery's bell would ring out at the same times every day, marking the progression of the divine office. This regular schedule imposed order on the formless stretch of dark hours. The most challenging time was the night. Long before dawn, the bell would summon the monks for matins and lauds, the night offices. Rising from their beds in the unheated dormitory, they would wrap themselves in their heavy woolen habits and make their way by the light of a single candle to the cavernous, freezing church. The ancient chant that echoed through the stone vaults was not just prayer. It was an act of communal endurance. The physical exertion of singing, the shared focus, and the faint warmth of their bodies gathered together helped them withstand the profound cold of the night. Following this, they might gather in the calefactory, or warming room, the one chamber, aside from the kitchen and infirmary, where a fire was permitted. Here, for a brief, precious interval, they could thaw their numb hands and feet before the next service, a small but critical concession to human frailty. After the morning offices, the monks would file into the refectory for their first meal. The monastic diet was simple but reliable, a stark contrast to the precarious food situation in the outside world. The monastery's stores of grain, vegetables from its gardens, and fish from its ponds were carefully managed to last the winter. A typical meal might consist of thick pottage, a hearty vegetable and grain stew bread, and a portion of cheese or fish, all washed down with beer. This beer, brewed on site, was a crucial source of calories and nutrients, and importantly, the brewing process made the water safe to drink. This warm, nutritious meal was a cornerstone of their physical survival, providing the energy needed for the day's labors. For many monks, the heart of their winter's work was the scriptorium. This was the writing room, often located on the sunniest side of the cloister to capture every possible minute of daylight. Here, the battle against the darkness was intellectual. The primary task was the copying of manuscripts, Bibles, liturgical texts, and the works of classical philosophers and theologians. This work was painstakingly slow and required immense concentration. In the depths of winter, light was a precious commodity. The large windows provided some illumination, but for much of the day, the monks relied on candles. Tallow candles made from animal fat were common, but the wealthy monasteries might use beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter without the smoky smell. Each monk had a carrel, a small wooden desk, and he would work for hours, his breath misting in the cold air, carefully dipping his quill into ink that could easily freeze if left unattended. The slow, deliberate act of copying was a form of meditation, but it was also an act of profound importance. While the world outside was locked in stasis, these men were actively preserving and transmitting knowledge, ensuring that the light of learning would not be extinguished by the long winter. The warmth generated by their focused activity, the faint heat of the candles, and the shared purpose made the scriptorium a hive of quiet industry, a place where the cold was held at bay not just by walls, but by the steady, warming glow of scholarship. For the wealthiest members of medieval society, the ability to command the seasons reached its most dazzling expression not within the smoky confines of a hall, but in a structure that seemed almost magical, the ice house. This was the pinnacle of pre-industrial refrigeration, a sophisticated feat of engineering that allowed a powerful lord or a wealthy monastery to preserve food and even enjoy chilled delicacies during the summer heat. The entire process began not in the warmth of the kitchen, but in the heart of winter, with a large-scale communal activity known as the ice harvest. When the local ponds and slow-moving rivers froze to a sufficient depth, often a foot or more, the entire estate would mobilize for this critical task. The Lord's steward would give the order, and a team of laborers, foresters, and stable hands would venture out onto the thick, clear ice. This was dangerous work. Checking the ice's thickness with augers was a crucial first step to prevent a catastrophic plunge into the freezing water below. Once deemed safe, the harvest commenced, transforming the silent, white expanse into a scene of focused industry. The tools of this trade were specialized and required skill to use effectively. The primary instrument was not an axe, which would shatter the ice, but a large, two-man ice saw. These saws had sharp, heavy teeth designed to bite deep into the frozen surface. One man would stand on either end, pulling the blade back and forth in a rhythmic motion, scoring a grid pattern into the ice. Other workers followed with ice chisels and picks to break the scored lines completely, freeing large, uniform blocks. The ideal block was a manageable rectangle, perhaps 2 feet long by 1 foot wide and a foot thick, weighing well over 100 pounds. To lift these slippery, heavy cubes from the water, workers used a tool that has remained largely unchanged for centuries: ice tongs. These were heavy-duty tongs with sharp, curved tips that would bite into the sides of the block when the handles were squeezed, providing a secure grip. Using wooden sledges or carts, the blocks were then hauled from the water's edge up to the ice house, a steady procession of men and animals moving the frozen bounty to its summer home. The true genius of the system, however, lay not in the harvesting, but in the storage. An ice house was far more than a simple pit. It was a carefully engineered structure designed to defy thermodynamics. Typically, it was located in a shaded spot, often built into the north side of a hill to benefit from the Earth's natural coolness. It consisted of a deep, conical or cylindrical pit, lined with brick or stone for stability and drainage. Above this, a sturdy, domed roof was constructed, heavily insulated with materials like turf, thatch, or even double walls filled with straw. The packing of the ice inside was a meticulous art. The bottom of the pit would first be covered with a thick layer of an insulating material, most commonly sawdust or straw. Then, the ice blocks were carefully stacked, like bricks in a wall, with each layer separated by another several-inch blanket of the same insulating material. This was the critical step. The sawdust or straw trapped countless tiny pockets of air, creating a powerful barrier that dramatically slowed the transfer of heat from the outside. It prevented the ice blocks from fusing together into one giant, unmanageable mass and, most importantly, it minimized the surface area of each block exposed to warmer air, drastically reducing the rate of melting. A drainage channel at the bottom of the pit carried away meltwater, ensuring the remaining ice stayed dry and intact. A well-designed and properly packed ice house was remarkably effective. It could preserve a significant portion of its winter harvest well into the following autumn, sometimes for over a year. For the lord of the manor, this was a tremendous asset. It meant his kitchen could preserve fresh fish, meat, and dairy products far beyond their normal lifespan. But it also enabled a level of luxury that was unimaginable to the common person: the ability to have chilled foods and drinks in the summer. Imagine the astonishment of a guest in July when presented with a sorbet made from summer berries, or a goblet of wine cooled with ice. This was not just a culinary delight. It was a breathtaking display of power and wealth. It demonstrated the Lord's ability to tame nature itself, to capture the brutal cold of January and unleash it as a refreshing novelty in August. The ice house, therefore, stands as a brilliant testament to medieval ingenuity, a silent, underground monument to the human desire to control the environment, turning the greatest threat of winter into a servant of summer comfort. But beyond the tangible strategies of wool and firewood, there existed another, more mystical layer to medieval winter survival, a world of folklore and superstition where people sought to read the intentions of the coming cold and influence their fate through ritual and belief. In an age without meteorological science, the approach of winter was shrouded in uncertainty and dread. To combat this fear, our ancestors developed a sophisticated oral almanac, a collection of weather lore passed down through generations that turned the entire natural world into a vast, prophetic text. Every animal's action, every plant's peculiarity, was scrutinized for clues about the severity of the months ahead. This was not mere quaint speculation. It was a vital attempt to gain an edge, to prepare psychologically and practically for what nature had in store. For instance, the behavior of squirrels was watched with intense interest. A common and persistent belief held that if squirrels were observed gathering nuts earlier than usual, or with exceptional frantic energy, it was a sure sign of a long and harsh winter. The thickness of a squirrel's tail or the depth of its midden, its cache of food, were also interpreted as indicators. Similarly, the altitude at which bees built their nests or the unusual migration patterns of birds were seen as omens. If geese flew south earlier than expected, or if field mice were seen desperately moving their nests into barns and homes, it was interpreted as the animals themselves heeding a warning that humans could not yet perceive. The plant kingdom offered its own prophecies. The abundance of berries on holly, hawthorn, and rowan trees was thought to be a direct message from nature. A heavy crop of bright red berries was not considered a generous gift from the land, but rather a grim portent. The lore suggested that nature provided this extra bounty precisely because it knew the winter would be brutal and the birds would need every last berry to survive. The same logic was applied to acorns. A mast year, when oak trees produced a tremendous surplus of nuts, was seen as nature stocking the pantry for a coming famine of cold. Even the humble onion was consulted. A method known as the onion prophecy involved peeling 12 onion skins, one representing each month of the year, and sprinkling each with a pinch of salt. The following morning, the amount of moisture drawn out by the salt in each skin was believed to predict the rainfall or snowfall for the corresponding month. This desire to quantify the unquantifiable, to break down the vague thread of winter into a monthly forecast, speaks to a deep human need for control. These signs provided a framework for action. A village elder observing these portents might advise the community to gather more firewood, salt more meat, or reinforce their roofs, turning abstract fear into a concrete plan. When the predictions pointed toward a terrible winter, people did not simply resign themselves to fate. They turned to rituals and superstitions designed to appease the forces of nature or divine their specific fate. The most pivotal moment of the winter calendar was the winter solstice, the shortest day and longest night of the year. This was a time of profound spiritual significance across Europe, a point where the barrier between the natural and supernatural worlds was believed to be thin. In the dim, cold landscape, the fear was not just of hunger, but of darker, spectral threats. Many cultures believed in the wild hunt, a phantom cavalcade of ghostly riders led by a mythical figure like Odin or King Herle, thundering across the winter sky. To witness the wild hunt was considered a death omen, and people would bar their doors and windows on stormy winter nights, fearing more than just the wind. To counteract this darkness and encourage the sun's return, communities engaged in rituals of light and noise. The tradition of the Yule log, a massive oak log selected with great care, was central to solstice celebrations. It was ceremoniously brought into the home and lit with a piece of the previous year's log, symbolizing continuity and the enduring power of fire. It was considered crucial that the Yule log burn continuously throughout the 12 days of Christmas, and its ashes were CREFULLY Chinese letter ED, and scattered over fields in the spring to ensure fertility, creating a tangible link between the depths of winter and the hope of spring. Another widespread custom involved wassailing, a practice with two distinct forms. One was a house visiting tradition where groups of people would go from door to door, singing and offering a drink from a wassail bowl, a concoction of warmed ale, spices, and roasted apples, in exchange for gifts. This reinforced community bonds during the isolating season. The other, more ancient form was the orchard wassail. Farmers would journey to their apple orchards on Twelfth Night, a time of potent magic. They would hang pieces of toast soaked in cider in the branches as an offering to the tree spirits, and then pour cider onto the roots. This will be accompanied by loud shouting, banging of pots and pans, and the firing of guns into the air. The goal was twofold: to wake the sleeping trees from their winter slumber and to frighten away any evil spirits that might be blighting the harvest. This noisy, celebratory ritual was an act of sympathetic magic, a bold attempt to command the fertility of the land through sound and offering. It transformed the silent, frozen orchard into a theater of hope, where the community actively participated in ensuring their own survival for the year to come. These beliefs and practices reveal that surviving winter was not just a physical battle, but a spiritual one, a continuous dialogue with a world alive with unseen forces, where the right ritual, performed at the right time, could be as important as a full larder. As the last embers of our journey into the medieval winter fade, what remains is not just a record of hardship, but a profound testament to a forgotten kind of genius. The story of survival in that frozen world is a tapestry woven with three unbreakable threads: raw ingenuity, the unyielding strength of community, and a resilience etched into the very bones of a society. It was a resilience born not from comfort, but from necessity, a daily dialogue with an environment that offered no second chances. Every stitch in a woolen cloak, every carefully banked fire, every snow cairn built on a desolate moor was a vote for life, a declaration that humanity would not be erased by the cold. This constant, intimate struggle did more than just keep people alive. It fundamentally shaped the medieval mind and the structures of their society. The need for mutual aid cemented feudal bonds. The collective labor of the harvest and the woodpile forged a powerful sense of place and shared destiny. And the experience of enduring together through the long darkness created a cultural toughness that is difficult to comprehend in our era of instant gratification and controlled environments. This deep ancestral wisdom, hard-won over centuries of frost and famine, raises a haunting question for us today. In our modern, climate-controlled world, where a thermostat dial guarantees warmth and a supermarket shelf promises food regardless of the season, what essential knowledge have we left behind? We have mastered our environment to an astonishing degree, but in doing so, have we lost the intuitive understanding of the natural world that once meant the difference between life and death? Could we read the warning in a squirrel's hurried gathering, or build a shelter from the very substance threatening us? The medieval winter was a brutal teacher, but its lessons in self-reliance, resourcefulness, and the irreplaceable value of community are echoes that still have something to tell us. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you have any family stories passed down about surviving harsh winters? Or perhaps your own ideas about what we might learn from our ancestors' resilience? Share your stories and reflections in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical mysteries, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our